Hello, and welcome back to another edition of Social Isolation Stories. I'm going to read today. I'm going to break it into two parts. This is a story. This is a story that I wrote for the Arctic Sounder, which is an Alaska newspaper that covers the Arctic of Alaska. About the expedition that we did in 2017 from Point Hope to Utqiagvik, and I published it in a two-part. I felt like I kind of had a lot to say, and I still feel like there's much more to say, and I've kind of written other little things around the trip, certain aspects of it that were very memorable. Maybe I'll eventually get to reading some of those in this format here. But what I'm going to do now is read part one, and then I will have another episode for part two. Okay, so the title is The Edge of Tomorrow, an Arctic Fat Bike Story. The sting of pebbles peppering the back of my legs reminded me to be grateful that the wind was at our back. In front of me, my three companions clamped down on their brakes and fought to retain control of their expedition-loaded fat bikes when the powerful gusts slammed us. We were 3 days into our Arctic expedition, riding over lichen-encrusted mountain paths in the western Brooks Range, when wind from a nightmare dream began to blow. The next, even more powerful gust flung us from our bikes. "This is fucking incredible," I yelled, as I hefted my loaded bike upright and leaned hard into the wind. With wide-eyed smiles and nervous laughter greeted my comment. The Beaufort wind scale labels wind speeds between 56 and 63 knots as a violent storm. Anything above 64 knots is hurricane. For the next 3 days, the winds hovered between those two classifications. Simple tasks like adding or removing a jacket required methodical intention. To let go of a strap or a sleeping pad, even for a second, meant risking it being blown out of reach, most likely never to be seen again. Over 1,000 miles to the south, in my cozy little cabin in coastal Alaska, lives a large shaded relief map of the state. It's a beautiful, well-designed map. It's a centerpiece fixture, a conversation starter, and a debate settler. This map is where many of our trip ideas first take seed. In the cold, dark month of December, my life partner, and now fiancé, Kim McNett, and I imagined an extensive, trailless fat bike traverse across the top of Alaska. Staring at the map, our fingers trace previous wilderness cycling trips, some of which have led us north above the latitude of the Arctic Circle. An idea began to take shape, to pick up where we'd left off and attempt a summer fat bike and packraft trip in the far north. Starting in the Inupiat Eskimo village of Point Hope, we conceived a route through mountains, along coastlines, passing through two villages, Point Lay and Wainwright, and terminating 450 miles later in the northernmost community in the U.S., Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow. This would be our first fat bike trip entirely above the Arctic Circle. The wind found us in the Lisburn Hills. This series of low-elevation mountains are the westernmost extent of the Brooks Range, which reside entirely above the Arctic Circle and dramatically terminate as sheer cliffs and capes into the Chukchi Sea. The treeless landscape of the western Brooks Range appeared ancient, and it was easy for me to imagine herds of mammoth, mastodon, and steppe bison roaming about, with Paleoarctic hunters in pursuit. As we rode over the mountain passes, my mind whirled. Despite the strong wind, I was in a bliss state. This is what I'd come for: raw, unadulterated Arctic wilderness. With the wind at our back, we were able to ride up and over the mountains. For 2 days, we were treated to the best off-trail cycling I've ever experienced. Long distances between villages, and thus resupply points, demand heavy loads. Kim and I, and our two traveling companions, Daniel and Elaine, who would join us as far as the first village of Point Lay, each carried 10 days' worth of food as we set out from Point Hope. As a parting gift, our friend, a Gaiak, an Inupiaq hunter, sent us off with traditional native food: dried whitefish, bearded seal jerky, and raw muktuk, whale fat and skin. This rich food has sustained northern people for thousands of years. Our group graciously accepted the food and the added insurance it bought us. We emerged out of the hills and onto a pebble beach some 5 miles east of Cape Lisburn. For some inexplicable reason, our two-way satellite tracker/texting device had been rapidly losing power. Our only chance of recharging the potentially life-saving device would be to retreat to the Cape, to Utqiagvik, a Cold War-era radar site, in the hope someone was there and that they had an outlet we could usurp for an hour. "There is no tomorrow," one of the 4 permanent employees at Utqiagvik told us. I assumed at first he meant the sun never sets in the summer and never rises in the winter, and therefore there is no such thing as a tomorrow. As we continued, however, I realized he meant something different. "If you have a good day in the Arctic, do not waste it," he said. "Tomorrow, the wind may be screaming, and whatever chore you needed done will have to wait for who knows how long." We didn't have the luxury of sitting out bad days, but his metaphor was good, and it rolled around in my mind for the entirety of the trip. 12 strenuous and rewarding days after setting out, we pulled into Point Lay, ravenous, our food nearly gone. The day of our auspicious arrival was the village's annual whaling festival, called Nalukataq. This ancient festival marks the end of the successful whaling season and honors the hunting crews who selflessly provide sustenance for the entire village. This festival, famous for its blanket toss, massive communal feast, and traditional dancing, is the Thanksgiving of the North. Inside the school gymnasium, tables piled high with mouth-watering food, we were ushered inside to the feast. Round after round of food was passed out, with elders respectfully being served first. We were treated to a delicious meal of traditional native food, including boiled beluga, bird soup, black and white muktuk, fry bread, and sweets. While eating, we received advice from the whaling captain and others. Our biggest concern about the route ahead was finding enough fresh water. On our unrolled map, fingers full of wisdom and local knowledge pointed out our best options. "There are 2 kinds of Arctic problems," Arctic adventurer Vilhjalmur Stephenson once said, "the imaginary and the real. Of the 2, the imaginary are the most real." As we said goodbye to Elaine and Daniel in Point Lay, our imaginations had settled down some. Polar bears were not hiding behind every rock, and what appeared to be the most challenging terrain was behind us. We left the village a smaller team, armed with local knowledge and a resupply of food, our confidence renewed. Days of painless travel flowed from one to the next as the terrain flattened and our routine settled in. Long hours of beach riding were punctuated with short paddles across deep channels of water, always making time to stop and observe abundant and varied wildlife. End of part 1.